Well, hey everyone, and welcome to the Crossway podcast. My name is Josh, and today I wanted to do something a little bit different than what's typical. So typically when I plan out the podcast content for the week, I try to fall a little bit in line with what we've been doing on our Sunday mornings in our sermon series, and try to elaborate on some points that are being made there. But this week I wanted to do something a little bit different, and I actually wanted to take a significant amount of time to add to the catalog of our podcast the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. I mean, as Christians, the resurrection of Jesus is what sits at the core of our faith in Him. As Paul says, if the resurrection did not occur, then our faith is useless. And so the resurrection sits as this cornerstone of our faith. And so I wanted to take some time and talk about what Jesus' ministry, the significance of Jesus' ministry before his death and resurrection, the things that Jesus claimed and did, and the titles that he took on for himself, and the significance of that in a Jewish context. And then I also wanted to look at reasons, historical reasons, that we have to think that the resurrection actually happened. So let's just start by talking about Jesus, who he claimed to be, what the significance of those claims were, and how that played out in his ministry, and what his disciples would have understood in their Jewish first century Jewish context about the things that Jesus was doing. And there's really three titles that Jesus takes for himself throughout his ministry that have weight and significance in the minds of the Jewish people and his disciples that would follow him. And those three titles are these. He claimed to be the Messiah. Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, and we'll go over what that is and what that would mean to the Jewish people. Jesus claimed to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and he also claimed to be the Son of Man. And so let's break down those three titles, sort of understand what Jesus thought about himself, what he communicated to the Jewish people by claiming those titles for himself, and the significance that this has for the resurrection. So let's look at that first title that Jesus took for himself, and that is the claim to be the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah. Now, the Messiah for the Jewish people was really an expectation for a political figure, a sort of political leader who was going to come and was going to overthrow the captors of Israel and bring Israel to peace. So in the Jewish mind, Messiah meant political leader who's going to, and in the first century specifically, political leader who's going to overthrow the yoke of Rome and is going to lead Israel into a peace, a state of peace, and out from their captivity. And so this is the significance of the sort of title that Messiah meant in the first century Jewish context. And the way that Jesus claimed this title for himself was actually in a very explicit and demonstrable way. And this, you'll probably recognize this event, was done by his riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. And so this, you've probably heard about this if you're a Christian, or even if you're not a Christian. It was just Palm Sunday, right, which is a celebration, day of remembering Jesus' riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, where the Jewish people waved palm branches and sang Hosanna. And this whole event was a specific and deliberate fulfillment of prophecy that came out of came from the prophet Zechariah, and I want to read that prophecy so you can hear it and see in the Old Testament and the way that the Jewish people would have understood. This is what they would have thought of when they saw this happening, so you can get an idea of what Jesus was deliberately doing here. So in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, it says, "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So Jesus riding into Jerusalem deliberately on a donkey was an explicit and deliberate claim to be the Messiah that the Jews were expecting, the Messiah that Zechariah had prophesied about, and the the figure that they had been waiting for all these years. And this is why they were celebrating when he rode into town on the donkey. They knew that this is what he was doing. He was claiming to be this Messiah, and they were rejoicing because they were looking forward to the freedom that Messiah represented for the nation of Israel. Another piece of support that goes to undergird the fact that Jesus made this claim about himself is the plaque that was nailed to his cross. So when Jesus was crucified, there was a plaque above his head that read, "The King of the Jews," right? And this was a sort of mockery about what he had claimed, right? He had claimed to be the King of the Jews, the Messiah, and the Roman government basically put this, the plaque above the head on the cross was where they would put the charge for the person that was being crucified. And this was a sort of mocking way of saying that you are not this Messiah. You have not overthrown us. You have been put to death. And anything you may have said or hinted at in your ministry, or explicitly, like riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, demonstrated was untrue. And so they made a mockery about this. So this goes to those two facts: the fact that Jesus did this, rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, and that he was crucified and mocked. With claims of being the King of the Jews and the Messiah, all point to Jesus having taken this title on for himself. Now, obviously, this would have been the crucifixion in particular would have been a devastating event for people who thought that Jesus was the Messiah, because Messiah was not supposed to die. And so you can already start to see how what the significance of Jesus' claim to be the Messiah is going to play into the resurrection later on. But that is the first title Jesus took on for himself, and that's how the Jewish people would have understood that title, to be the Messiah, they would have thought Jesus to be this political figure who was going to come, and he's going to overthrow Rome in the first century at that time, and he was going to lead Israel into peace and freedom. The second claim, or second title that Jesus took and claimed for himself, is the Son of God. Now, in the modern century, for us, this seems like a more significant title, right? Son of God sounds like you were born of God, right? Like what we understand about Jesus today seems to fit nicely under that title. But actually, in the older Israel and first century, the Son of God was a title that had been used before, and it really was a reference to a prophet, somebody who spoke on behalf of God. And so Son of God here is sort of used in that sense by Jesus, but with a caveat. Jesus claims to be this sort of Son of God, but in a unique sense. And this is demonstrated most clearly in the parable of the vineyard that Jesus tells. And I just want to read just a few passages where you can see this. And I'll read it from the top. It says, "Listen to another parable," Jesus says. "There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. And then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. When the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit. And the tenants seized his servants, and they beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. Then he sent other servants to them, more than the first time, and the tenants treated them the same way. And last of all, he sent his son to them. 'They will respect my son,' he said. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, 'This is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take his inheritance.' So they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him." And so there's more to that parable, and there's more that Jesus has to say, but something that is that I want to draw your attention to in the parable that Jesus is telling here is the uniqueness of this last son that was sent to the tenants in the vineyard. And this is the uniqueness that Jesus is claiming upon himself when he uses the title, the Son of God. Jesus is saying, there have been sons of God that have come before me. There have been prophets that have come before me to speak on behalf of God. But I am doing this in a unique sense, in in this intimate, related sense. I am the heir of Israel, and I am uniquely speaking on behalf of God. And this, it's not the title that would have irked people, but it's his explanation of it in these parables. Had they understood what he was saying, that would have irked people, because Jesus is claiming a sort of intimate relationship with God that crosses a line for the Jewish people, right? And this is exaggerated and emphasized even more so in the third title that Jesus claims for himself, which is the Son of Man. Now, this again, in the century we live in, the Son of Man sounds like the less significant title that Jesus would have claimed for himself. But in the first century, the title the Son of Man and the way that Jesus referred to himself, and this is Jesus' favorite title for himself, by the way. He uses this title for himself much more than he does the others. But the title to be the Son of Man is actually a claim to the title of a figure prophesied by Daniel in Daniel chapter 7, in verses 13 through 14, and we'll read them in just a second. And this figure is a figure that has a significant authority and is worthy of worship, and this is the title that really set Jesus, that Jesus claimed for himself, that really bothered the Jewish people, because this put him on a par with God the Father, and with the Ancient of Days, right, as they would have understood God to be called. And so this bothered the Jewish people. And I want to read this prophecy in Daniel chapter 7, so you can get the context and the immediate understanding the Jewish people would have had when Jesus claimed this title for himself. So in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, it says, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and people of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." And so you can see the significance of this Son of Man figure in Daniel and what Jesus was claiming for himself, and why that would be bothersome to the Jewish people. And in fact, when Jesus was on trial right before his crucifixion, the Jewish high priest asked him if he was the Messiah, the Son of God. And in Jesus' response, you can see this is where he goes all in with these title claims, and he claims all three of these titles, and even quotes straight out of Daniel in his response. And I'll read the response. So Jesus says, "I am the Messiah and the Son of God, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And so here, Jesus could not be any more explicit. He is claiming to be this figure from Daniel chapter 7. And that is why the Jewish high priest's response is to tear his clothes and accuse Jesus of being blasphemous at that point. And then he is put to death. And they have him crucified. There's very weighty significance in what Jesus was claiming and what Jesus was doing throughout his ministry. Jesus wasn't just claiming to be the Messiah. He wasn't just claiming to be a prophet, but he was claiming to be a unique prophet, a unique speaker on God's behalf that was intimately connected with him. And he was claiming to be this divine figure that was talked about in the book of Daniel. And so Jewish people were so confused. Even Jesus' disciples were radically confused by some of the things that Jesus would say and do, and what they were expecting him to do, and the way that he was acting and communicating, and so there was a lot of anger and accusation of blasphemy against Jesus, and this spilled throughout the things that he did in his ministry. These title claims played themselves out in the way that he did his ministry. Jesus performed miracles, right? And he casted out demons, and he revised Old Testament law, right? When he declared all foods to be clean in Mark chapter 7, and he forgave people's sins. But the significance of all of these things that he was doing, because disciples and followers of God had done this before. The significance of what Jesus was doing here was he was doing it in his own authority. Right? He wasn't doing it in the name of God. He was doing it in his own name. And this is what bothered people about Jesus throughout his ministry. And this is what the Jewish leaders and the Jewish high priests and the Pharisees despised about Jesus so much, is because he was taking the authority above them in a unique way by basically putting himself on a par with God, with the ability to forgive sins in his own name. And let me read to you just one example of that happening in Matthew chapter 9, verse 2 through 8. It says, some men brought to him a paralyzed man lying on a mat. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the man, "Take heart, son, your sins are forgiven." And at this, some of the teachers of the law said to themselves, "This fellow is blaspheming." Knowing their thoughts, Jesus said, "Why do you entertain evil thoughts in your heart? Which is easier, to say your sins are forgiven, or to say get up and walk? But I want you to know that the Son of Man," and there's that title claim, "the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." So he said to the paralyzed man, "Get up, take your mat, and go home." And then the man got up and went home, and when the crowd saw this, they were filled with awe, and they praised God who had given such authority to man. And so this is just one example of where Jesus is doing these miracles, and he's forgiving sins, and he's doing all of his ministry in his own name. And you can see the reaction by the Jewish leaders there. They are immediately... they feel that tension and saying that Jesus is blaspheming. And so all of this, all of the work that Jesus did in his ministry, the titles that he claimed for himself, and the understanding the Jews would have had for those titles, is really what brings the whole weight of significance to the resurrection. Because if the resurrection actually occurred, then it seems like there is a good reason to believe that everything that Jesus claimed and did was correct, that God has vindicated Jesus in everything that he was accomplishing in his ministry, everything he was describing to people about himself, and the authority and the divinity that he claimed in the titles that he took for himself. And this is why the resurrection has such a significance to the Jewish people and to the followers that Jesus had. So let's talk then about the evidence that we have for the resurrection having actually occurred. Specifically, let's look at some historical grounds for thinking that the resurrection is best explained by the historical facts that we have about Jesus' death. And so let's just start with three facts that are accepted by the majority of New Testament scholars who are doing history in this particular area. And when I say the majority of New Testament scholars, I don't mean Christians, and I don't mean scholars who are already committed to following Jesus. What I mean is scholars who look at New Testament documents, no matter where they come from, what sort of worldview they have. The majority of those scholars agree on these three facts, which I think best explain the resurrection having actually happened. So let's look at those three facts. Let's give some evidence for them, and then let's look at some alternative explanations to these facts and see if they hold up as well as the resurrection. And the first fact is this, that Jesus' tomb was found empty on the first day of the week following his crucifixion. The second fact is that many of Jesus' followers experienced appearances of him being alive after his death. And that's not to say that they were legitimately seeing him after his death, but they at least had these experiences of seeing him after his death. And then the third fact that is accepted by most New Testament scholars is that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, despite having every preconceived idea to the contrary. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. So let's go through each one of these facts and talk about the evidence that we have to support these facts, why most scholars take these to be historically credible facts, and then let's look at explanations of these facts and see what explanation best accounts for them. And so that first fact is Jesus' tomb was found empty on the first day of the week following his crucifixion. What evidence do we have to support the fact that Jesus' tomb was found empty? Well, one of the first pieces of evidence that we have that best explains the tomb of Jesus actually being empty is the fact that Jesus was buried and that his burial site was known by the Romans, and that the first response to claims about Jesus' tomb being empty was not to point to the tomb and say, it isn't empty, he's in here, everything you're saying is false, but instead it was to come up with some other reason. For example, the disciples stole the body, right? So Jesus' burial site was known, and the Roman response, the initial Roman response to claims about Jesus' tomb being empty was not to point to the tomb, or not to point to Jesus' body, or produce Jesus' body in some capacity, but instead it was to say that the disciples stole the body. And that fact supports the fact that the tomb was probably most likely really empty. And something else that goes to support the tomb being empty is the fact that it's actually reported in 6 independent sources. And those sources are found in 1 Corinthians, and in Luke, in Matthew, in John, and in Mark. And now I know when we think about independent sources and we think about the New Testament, it's easy for us to, especially those of us who aren't New Testament historians, to get confused and think, well, all of that's coming from the same book or the same source. But that's not actually the case. The New Testament is actually made up of many different sources, many different books that were later collected and combined and bound together and put under the label of the New Testament. But in the New Testament, we do have independent sources of people writing about the same events. And the significance of this and the significance of independent sources reporting the same thing is that when you have different people who are independent of each other saying the same thing, the likelihood that that thing actually happened goes up. Right? If you have 6 different people that you're talking to, and they're all talking about some event, and maybe they're saying different things about the event from their perspective or whatever, but they all say the same thing about one particular fact, well, then the likelihood of that fact being true goes way up, because it's unlikely that they would have each independently made up the same thing. And so that is another factor that we have that goes to support the fact that Jesus' tomb was actually empty. We have independent sources, 6 independent sources, that make empty tomb reports. And so the fact that these sources are independent from one another and they're all saying the same thing points to the fact that Jesus' tomb was actually empty. A third fact that we have is that Mark's account of the empty tomb is the earliest report, and it's free of any sort of theological embellishment. So when you have a report about something, and if it's a made up, let's say it's a made up report, and you're trying to make this up to convince somebody of something, you're going to really try to sell it to them, right? And typically what this will look like is embellishment. It'll look like either theological embellishment or some sort of defensive embellishment. And when we look at the Gospel of Mark, that's not what we see at all. Mark is very simple in its report of the empty tomb. There's no lingering on the fact that the tomb was found empty. There's no embellishment. It's very simple and stark. Compare that to something like what comes much later and is actually a forgery that's not in the New Testament, called the Gospel of Peter. Not the book of Peter, but the Gospel of Peter, which, like I said, is a forgery that was discovered much later on, where it describes an empty tomb scenario. And in that description, it talks about a cross coming out of the tomb, and it's all lit up, and there's a loud booming voice when it exits the tomb, and this is the way that the tomb was discovered. That's the sort of theological embellishment that you would expect to find mind if somebody was writing and making something up in order to be convincing, right? But when you look at Mark, it is so early and it is so simple that it lends credibility to the report that's written there. So that's another reason that we have to think that Jesus' tomb was actually discovered empty. And then the last piece of support that we have to support this is the fact that it was women that are reported to have discovered the empty tomb. So in the first century, in the first century Jewish context in particular, women's testimony was considered pretty much worthless. Women's testimony wouldn't stand up in Jewish court, and so there was no credit. There's no credit to the women's testimony in the first century context. And so if this was a story, if this report of the discovery of the empty tomb were to be made up, it's very unlikely that the disciples would have written women as the discoverers of the empty tomb. If I was making up a story in the first century, trying to convince you something had actually happened, it's very, very unlikely I would use women to try and convince you that this is the way that it went down. And so the question becomes, well, why did Mark and why did all of these people, these disciples, write women as the discoverers of the empty tomb? And the most likely explanation is that it was women who discovered the empty tomb. And so the fact that it was women that discovered the empty tomb lends credibility to this event having actually happened. And so we have those four reasons to think that the tomb was indeed empty, that the Roman response was not, here's the body, it was, the body is stolen, that we have independent sources reporting the same thing. We have Mark's very simple report about the empty tomb, so unlikely to be embellished or written for any sort of way to convince or something like that. And then we have the women being the discoverers of the empty tomb, which would have been embarrassing, frankly, in the early first century. And that's the first fact: Jesus' tomb is found empty. The second fact that's historically accepted by New Testament scholars is that many of Jesus' followers experienced appearances of him alive after his death. And again, like I said earlier, that's not to say that these experiences or that they legitimately saw Jesus alive, but it is to say that they did in fact have these experiences. They did in fact think that they were seeing the risen Jesus. And this is also attested by independent sources, specifically in the lists of the eyewitnesses. So the disciples and even Paul would very often give lists of people that Jesus had appeared to in order to convince people that Jesus had been risen from the dead. These lists, when compared, were independent of each other, but the same. And what's specifically Paul's list that he gives in 1 Corinthians 15 is a very early oral tradition that was given at the time of that the eyewitnesses were alive, right? And the significance of that is that people could go and check with these people and say, did you really have this experience? Are you really claiming to have seen Jesus alive? And let me read to you from Paul's letter in 1 Corinthians 15 in chapter 3, what he says, the list that he gives, and the way that he presents it to people, so you can sort of have an idea about this. In 1 Corinthians 15:3, Paul says, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance." And really, that statement is a little bit significant because what Paul is saying here is that this is an oral tradition that he received himself much earlier than he is writing in this letter. Paul, and this is not unique in the Jewish culture. Much of the tradition was passed down orally. It wasn't written. And so Jewish people would have loads of traditions memorized that was passed down. And this was not like, a game of telephone like we would play now. This was a skill set that the Jewish people had that was very highly developed and highly accurate. And so this is what Paul opens up by saying. He's saying, I have received this oral tradition that I'm now passing on to you as of first importance. And here's where he begins the oral tradition. He says that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, which is Peter, another name for Peter, and to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. And so this list that that Paul gives is significant in a couple of ways. First, like we said, this list is similar to lists that other disciples would give when reporting the eyewitness accounts of having seen Jesus, having had this experience of seeing Jesus. And so these lists matched up, which lends to their credibility being accurate, at least in those particular people having had those experiences. But something else that's really significant about this list that Paul gives is the diversity of people in this list of eyewitnesses. You have Jesus appearing not just to one person, but to groups, 500 people at once, Paul says. Not just to Jesus' followers, but to people who were skeptical about Jesus when he was alive. Paul says he appeared to James. James here is referring to James, the brother of Jesus. And James was not a follower of Jesus. He was skeptical about Jesus, and that shifted after having this experience. And so, I mean, just think about it. What would it take for you to consider your brother to be the Lord of your life, right? Some significant event, some significant experience happened with James, and then he lists other apostles, and he lists even enemies of Jesus, which would be Paul himself, right? Paul was completely against the Christian movement when it first began. He was a persecutor of Christians, and it's his experience of seeing Jesus or this appearance to him that changed him so radically. And so it's not just the fact that you have this independent attestation when it comes to the people who claim to have seen Jesus, and it's not just it's also the fact that you have this such diversity, right? You have people who were not followers of Jesus. You have individuals. You have groups of people. You have people who were enemies of Jesus. And so it's this diversity, and it's this the fact that you could the Jewish people could go and communicate with these people who had claimed to have these experiences that lends credibility to the fact that yes, they did in fact have these experiences. There's just too much diversity. There's just too much uniqueness per situation, and this was not denied by the people that were said to have seen Jesus. So, now that's not to say that they actually did see Jesus, but it is to say that most historical scholars, when looking at the New Testament documents, affirm that people had these experiences of Jesus appearing to them. And then the third fact that's accepted by most scholars is the fact that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. And this is probably one of the more obvious facts about Jesus's followers. This is seen obviously in the fact that many of Jesus's followers were willing to be killed and martyred for the fact that they had seen Jesus resurrected from the dead. Now, that doesn't mean that Jesus was actually raised from the dead, but it does mean that they were fully and sincerely convinced that he had been. Because nobody dies people may die for something they believe and it's false, but nobody dies for something they don't believe. Truly, right? And that's the significance here. Jesus' original disciples suddenly and sincerely believed that he was raised from the dead, despite having all the preconceived ideas to the contrary, right? They weren't expecting Messiah to die. Some of them probably thought and had doubts about Jesus and maybe thought he really was a blasphemer because of the way that he committed things and the way that he died. When you died in the first century via crucifixion, in the Jewish law, you were considered to be cursed. And so everything pointed to Jesus not being the Messiah, not being the Son of Man, not being the unique Son of God, because not only was Messiah not supposed to die, but Jesus died in as a cursed man, as a man who was not in the favor of God. And so they didn't have this predisposition to think that Jesus was going to be resurrected. And something else that's significant about the resurrection here that I just want to sort of add as a side is that the resurrection is, when we talk about resurrection in the first century Jewish context, we're not just talking about coming back from the dead, right? Jesus had done that in his ministry prior to, right? When he raised Lazarus from the dead. What we're talking about in this context, when the Jewish people heard resurrection, they thought resurrection at the end of the world into a glorified and immortal state, a final transformation of their body that would be glorified and everlasting. And so to say that somebody had been resurrected prior to the end of the world was not a Jewish idea. This was not, again, to pile that on top of not an expectation that they had about Messiah, not expectation they had about somebody who claimed all the things that Jesus claimed, not expectation about the resurrection. So this sudden shift in the disciples' beliefs is a fact that can't be denied, right? They like I said, they were willing to go and die for the fact that they believed that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead, and that their idea of Messiah and the things that Jesus had done was all radically different than what they originally expected. And so this is why, and for all those reasons, it's why the majority of New Testament scholars accept those three facts: that Jesus' tomb was actually found empty, that Jesus' followers had these sort of experiences of him appearing to them after his death, and that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. So now the question is, what is the best explanation of those three facts? Those three facts are supported by history very well. So what's the best explanation of them? Well, there have been some sort of, obviously, as a Christian, I agree with the original disciples. I think it's the resurrection that explains all of those things the best. But for historical analysis' sake, let's look at some naturalistic explanations and see how well they hold up. And there's actually a few. So let's go through just a few of them. So the first one is the one that the Romans originally presented, and it's one that most scholars reject today just because it doesn't account for the evidence very well, and that is the conspiracy theory. And the conspiracy theory basically says that the disciples stole the body of Jesus and lied about the resurrection. Now, we've already sort of responded to this a little bit, but let's just give a few quick responses so we can go on to some other ones. First of all, the disciples need to be looked at in the context of first century Judaism, right? Not Christianity. And we just talked about that. So Jewish expectation was not a resurrecting Messiah, not even a dying Messiah. It was not a blasphemer not being cursed on the cross, right? Like that, the expectation was not for a resurrection. It was not for a resurrection happening before the end of the world. And so when you look at the Jewish people through the proper lens of their time and their culture, it becomes clear that this is not a lie. This lie there was nothing that would have preempted this lie. If it was a lie at all, right? This was not the mindset of a first century Jew. But second, and probably more importantly, a bash against this theory, is that people don't die for things they know are untrue, right? We just said this also. The disciples were at least sincere in their beliefs. Even if they were wrong, they were at least fully convinced. And so the fact that the disciples would go to these horrifying deaths, even some James, the brother of Jesus, who was not a follower of Jesus and became one after, and went to and was killed. That Josephus tells us in his Jewish history that James was killed for his belief in Jesus. That is not even remotely likely if these things that were being propagated by Jesus's followers after his resurrection, or after his supposed resurrection, was false. The disciples were at least sincere in their, or was a lie, rather, sorry. They were at least sincere in the things that they believed. And so the conspiracy theory is probably a far-fetched theory. I don't think many scholars would really take it all that seriously. The disciples, at the very least, were fully convinced themselves. And so there's no evidence to support the fact that they had conspired and died for what they knew to be a lie. A second theory, a second way of trying to explain the empty tomb and some of these things, these facts that we know to be true about Jesus, is something that's been labeled the apparent death theory. The apparent death theory. And that theory is basically that Jesus didn't really die, but instead he escaped from his tomb and convinced his disciples he had risen from the dead. And this... I mean, on the face of it, this sounds far-fetched to me, but let's look at some reasons to think that this isn't true. First, it's medically impossible, right? Like, the Romans were experts at crucifixion. Jesus' crucifixion was not their first nailing to a cross by any means. They knew what they were doing. And even if Jesus had survived the death on the cross, he most likely would have died in the tomb immediately after, right? Like, they would have had to so royally mess up in their crucifixion that Jesus wasn't even close to death. And that's just very, very unlikely. But apart from that, even if Jesus had survived and somehow escaped from the tomb, and even that is far-fetched. If the story of Jesus' burial is true, and he's put in a tomb, and it's closed, he's now in this half-crucified state, and he's escaping, and now he's going to go to his disciples, and what? It's very unlikely that his disciples would have been convinced that a half-beaten, half-dead man in need of serious medical attention has been resurrected from the dead into his immortal and glorified state that we talked about, and is the Messiah after all. It's just very unlikely that they would have ever come to that conclusion. And so the apparent death theory also is just as far-fetched, I think, as the conspiracy theory. And then I think most scholars actually agree on that as well, that this is not indicative of something that would have led to the belief that you are the Messiah, you've been resurrected, and we're going to follow you, and it's just very, very unlikely. A third theory that has come up that I think scholars also don't really give too much weight is the displaced body theory. The displaced body theory, and that is that Jesus' body, this is the theory that Jesus' body was moved from the tomb after Joseph of Arimathea, who is the Jewish part of the Jewish Sanhedrin that was said to bury Jesus, after he moved him to a criminal's graveyard. The theory is that Jesus' body was moved to a criminal's graveyard from the tomb that Joseph of Arimathea put him in. And there's a couple reasons to think that this is not true. First is that there's actually Jewish law that prohibited moving a corpse after it was buried, except to a family tomb a year later. And this is actually tied up in resurrection thought. There's a lot of hesitation. Jewish people preserved the bones specifically of the Jewish people in order that their bones are the bones were thought to be the sort of material that's used in the resurrection process, and so there were lots of laws surrounding burial and what could happen. And there was Jewish law that prohibited moving the body of Jesus of a Jew except to a family tomb at least a year later, and so it's very unlikely that Jesus' body would have been moved, especially by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. But secondly, and this is sort of tied in with an explanation from the conspiracy theory, is that once the disciples began to proclaim the resurrection, right, Joseph of Arimathea would have corrected them immediately at that point and pointed to Jesus' body at this tomb that he had moved it to, right? So if Jesus' body had been moved, it's very unlikely that nobody would have known that it was moved, right? And that when the disciples started going around and saying, "I've seen the risen Jesus," they would have just pointed back to Jesus's body. So again, this displaced body theory doesn't account for the fact. It may account for the fact that Jesus' tomb was found empty, but it doesn't account for the fact that they had these experiences and that the disciples' beliefs shifted after having those experiences. And it also doesn't explain why the movement got off the ground, because they could have easily squashed it at that point, but they were unable to. And then the last theory I want to talk about, I know this is a lot, but I sort of want to give you a groundwork. This is all very basic, and I sort of want to give you the groundwork to think about this from a historical perspective, and some of the things that people might say are better explanations than the resurrection, which are in fact not really. And the fourth theory is the hallucination theory. And that theory is the one that the disciples hallucinated in seeing Jesus alive. They didn't actually see him. So this is an attempt to explain that second fact, that people had these experiences of Jesus, but the reason they had these experiences is because they're hallucinating. Well, the first problem with that, right off the bat, is that it doesn't explain the fact of the empty tomb, right? Even if they did have these hallucinatory experiences, it doesn't explain, if you're going to say that, it doesn't explain the fact that Jesus' tomb was found empty. You'd have to come up with some other theory to combine with the hallucination theory in order to explain that fact as well. So it falls short as an explanation as a whole because it's limited in scope. It only explains or attempts to explain one thing. But also the problem with this is that, again, like we talked about earlier, the forms of appearances and the diversity of appearances goes beyond the scope of a hallucination as an explanation, right? Jesus appeared many times and in many places, and not just to one person, but to groups of people, including unbelievers, right? Like Paul and James, like we mentioned earlier. And so hallucinations seems very unlikely to try and explain that diversity of appearances. It may be one type of hallucination, like grieving would explain one sort of hallucination, but then that doesn't explain the appearance to James or to Paul or to the groups of people. And so hallucination sounds like it's not a good explanation. It doesn't, even in attempting to explain the appearances, I think it's too limited in scope and doesn't work. But secondly, hallucinations would have led the Jews to believe something other than what they came to believe, because hallucinations are a product of your own mind, right? And like we said earlier, the Jewish expectations, the product of the Jewish mind was not what they came to believe in. And so if the Jews were to hallucinate about Jesus after he had died, it's very unlikely that they would have hallucinated the kinds of things that or Jesus being resurrected, right? That's not a Jewish thought. It's not the way Jewish thought about resurrection, so it's unlikely they would have hallucinated that way at all. And so for all those reasons, I think the hallucination theory falls short too. So all of that to say, all of these naturalistic explanations, I think, don't really even start to get at explaining the facts we know about Jesus, that his tomb was found empty, that the disciples experienced, or the people experienced these appearances of Jesus after his death, and that the disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the opposite of that. And so I think the best explanation, and the explanation that I think we stand on strongly as Christians, is the one that the original disciples gave, that Jesus was actually resurrected from the dead, and that explains why his tomb was empty. That explains why so many of these people claimed to see him, including people who did not follow Jesus, and it explains why his disciples so fervently believed in their new understanding of Messiah, and as Jesus as the Son of Man and as the unique Son of God, to the point where they were willing to die for it. And I think it explains I also think it explains the truth of the resurrection, explains why this is something that we still are confident in today, because these original men had these legitimate experiences, and that we can actually experience Jesus ourselves today. Maybe not in this appearance sort of way, but we can know him, and we can have a relationship with him through the Holy Spirit that he told his disciples he would send. Well, thanks, guys, so much for sticking with me through that. If you are interested in doing some of your own research on this, there is a lot more to be said about this than what I said. This was just a sort of brief, I say brief, it's been 50 minutes already. This was sort of a brief overview of the sort of conversation that can be had just from a purely historical analysis way about the Gospels and what we know about Jesus. If you want to follow up with some, let me give you some recommendations, some book recommendations that you can look to. The first is a very big book. I'll start with a small book called The Sun Rises by William Lane Craig. The Sun Rises, S-O-N, Rises. That's very similar content to what we just went over now. A sort of meteor book that you can look at, pretty hefty, is a book called The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach, and that's by Michael Licona. So if you're interested in following up in doing some more research yourself, go check out some of these books. William Lane Craig, Mike Licona, N.T. Wright is another great resource, author to look at. And if you're interested in some more historical analysis of the Gospels, their reliability, and the historical facts we know about Jesus. Well, thanks, guys, so much. If you're interested in checking out more episodes of the podcast from previous weeks, you can find those on our YouTube channel or on our Facebook page or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, any of your favorite streaming platforms. And don't forget to download the Church Center app on crossway.news. Thanks, and we'll see you again next time.